Hello, well here we are at Knowsley Hall. I'm stood here in the gardens. You can see the hall just behind me. A magnificent property, which of course is the seat, the home of the Earls of Derby. And which is fortunate because of course we've got an interview with the 19th Earl of Derby, and with the Earl we're going to discuss trusts, charities, the idea of being a trustee, and of course the university, because the current Earl, as well as at least two of his forebears, and are heavily involved in the university, which is good. So, enough of this wandering around the garden, let's go and interview the Earl. So, walk with me, let's go. Okay, good morning. Here we are in the latest version of our equity shorts, and as you can see I'm in the Walnut Room at Knowsley Hall, but more importantly of course I'm joined by the 19th Earl of Derby, who's kindly agreed to speak to us today about, well, his family and ancestors, but in the context of our subject, so in the context of trusts and how they have perhaps impacted or influenced both his ancestors but also his current work. He's a trustee of over 100 different charitable organisations, and of course we have Knowsley Safari Park as well, which we might touch on. So just by way of introduction, so Lord Derby is the 19th Earl of Derby. We'll touch on his ancestors, the previous 18 Earls, and perhaps before the earldom was created in 1485, we'll talk about some of the previous members of the Stanley family as well. So it's a very important family in the history of our nation. Amongst Lord Derby's ancestors there are of course prime ministers, ex-foreign secretaries, ambassadors to France, governor generals of Canada, very famous naturalists, and later on we might see some of the collection of the pertinent Earls collection in the library here at Knowsley Hall. So we're very lucky. We're also lucky, of course, because the current Earl, Lord Derby, is heavily involved in the university. So he's a member of the council. I think, are you president?
I'm president
of the council, so the most important member of the council. We gave him an honorary degree in 2008 as well to reflect the long relationship, which is of course even longer than the current Earl, because the 16th Earl was the
16th Earl was the founding Chancellor, the 17th Earl was another Chancellor, and then his younger son, my great uncle, was the third Chancellor. So the first 50 years of the university, yeah. Earls of Derby, or members of the Stanley family, were Chancellor.
Have a very long link. So, and this is great because of course this is yet another link in that long chain, but this time not in the sort of general administrative sense, but in the subject sense, which is of course what our university is all about, getting to grips with the minutiae of one of our subjects. So what we'll do now is move to our questions, and the first question that I'd like to put to Lord Derby is this: would you please be able to give us a general introduction to your family, and perhaps some of the highlight points about how they've impacted or led to important elements in our history in England and Wales and beyond?
Well, it's really rather humbling to come from a family that has been so interconnected with British history throughout. And our roots start back as King's Foresters in Macclesfield Forest in the Peak District, and early signs of forestry on the Wirral, and hence the family crest is stag's heads in the middle of the shield. We have been closely prominent throughout history. We think of the way that Shakespeare, who was employed as one of Lord Strange's players, that was the courtesy title used in the early days, meaning the oldest son of the Earl of Derby. And Shakespeare treated us well when you look at Richard III, and there is Lord Stanley placing the crown on Henry VII's head at the Battle of Bosworth Field, since Stanley's army was bigger than either the King's or Richmond's, and he had a foot in both camps, being Lord High Steward of Richard III's household. And he was married to Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII. Then we talk about the Shakespearean connection and huge links throughout. The Civil War took a downturn in the family fortunes, and in the Walnut drawing room here, the 7th Earl, known as the Martyr Earl, who was beheaded after the Battle of Worcester. There were 2 sieges of Latham House, which was the family seat at the time, and Cromwell was so angry at the end of it, he said it was to be pulled down so it could never again be defended. The family then lost a lot of money and lands. The 8th Earl said, we'll get our money back and our lands back. The 9th Earl said the same. The 10th Earl said, we're not going to get our money back and we're not going to get our lands back. But I've married a rich heiress from Sussex, and so we will extend our hunting lodge, Knowsley Hall, and hence that's the point at which it became the primary family seat. The 12th Earl in the 1770s founded, rather unusually, a horse race starting first for the girls, the Oaks. In 1779, the classic, one of the 5 classics in the country, the Oaks, run for a mile and a half for fillies. Happens at Epsom. The Oaks was the name of the family house there. And a year later started the Derby, which was then for the colts. We moved on through, and it was his son, who was a great natural historian, who found Edward Lear painting as a young man in Regent's Park Zoo, where my forebear was president, was so impressed by his drawings of the watercolours that he brought him up to Knowsley. And Edward Lear spent 5 years painting the menagerie here and wrote all his nonsense rhymes, The Owl and the Pussycat and so on. They're all dedicated to the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, grandnephews and grandnieces. There's a long-winded preamble on the page. His son, the 14th Earl, was Prime Minister, still 3 times, started life as a Whig, became a Tory, still the longest-serving leader of the Conservative Party. His son, Lord Stanley, served as his Foreign Secretary, and then he walked across the floor of the House and became Liberal Colonial Secretary. The 16th Earl, perhaps more famously known, apart from his connection with the University of Liverpool, was as Governor-General of Canada as Lord Stanley, and he had an ice hockey team there called the Rideau Rebels, named after Government House, Rideau House, and the Stanley Cup was a cup he gave to the nation for their ice hockey, and is today still one of the world's most famous sporting trophies. And his oldest son, the 17th Earl, was Postmaster General at the outbreak of the First World War. He then became the Army's Director General of Recruiting. He was the person who came up with the concept of the PALS battalions, which so successfully raised thousands and thousands of men, and indeed the first 3,000 or so were all billeted here in the grounds at Knowsley Hall. They were all given a silver cap badge with the family crest, the eagle and child. And I think it's almost unique in the history of the British Army that a family crest should be used as a regimental cap badge. And the Derby Pals, the Liverpool Pals, they were a great fighting force, but tragically had this idea of raising men who worked together, who lived together, who could then fight together. But of course the first day of the Somme took a terrible toll, and whole families, whole offices, whole communities were devastated by the losses. His son died young, and the previous Earl, the 18th Earl, my uncle, inherited in 1948, and he had won his military cross at Anzio, was very involved in all things Northwest, and served as Lord Lieutenant of Lancashire. He was married, died childless. The middle brother, Richard Stanley, also married and died childless, and I was the son of a 3rd son, so didn't grow up expecting to arrive at Knowsley. I'll only give that long-winded explanation as it will slightly leads into your whole tax and trust use and how it relates into...
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah, in the planning sense, yeah, that's sort of very important. Just whilst we're here, because I thought in the sense of this historical exposition of your ancestors, and you touched on the Shakespearean link, I thought maybe we could say, because of course the National Trust now has in its possession Rufford Hall, so I just wondered if you might say something or had any thoughts about that property and the way in which that is now held for the nation's benefit with that form of trust, that charitable organisation.
Well, the National Trust is clearly a remarkable organisation. It grew up out of a need. These enormous stately homes were falling apart. There wasn't the money to retain them, to support them, to rebuild them, and it's served and continues to serve an amazingly useful purpose. With, I think, now something approaching 4 million members paying an annual subscription. So no property can go into the National Trust without a very good endowment, because the trust would be quite wrong to take on properties that couldn't have some chance of paying the way. Yeah. But I think it was formed out of a realisation that it is immensely difficult to keep these old properties going, and they selectively look at that which is really important to bring into their portfolio.
Yeah, and Rufford being an example of that, absolutely, which takes us to our next question, actually. So thanks very much for that exposition of your ancestors. We'll touch on some of them again, perhaps in due course, when we talk about sort of acquisitions into the estates and perhaps the way in which property was held, or at least thought about. But our second question is this. So you've mentioned Latham House, and we've just mentioned Rufford Hall. Part of the themes of Equity Shorts, as we've discussed, is the idea of Liverpool as a backdrop to all that which we do. And you've mentioned the Northwest already as an important area. So we have filmed at the Latham Chapel, for example, and Rufford Hall, and a whole host of other places, and now luckily here at Knowsley as well. And we filmed at Knowsley Safari Park, actually, where a monkey did attack my car, which features in the video. But anyway, so I was wondering, in terms of a question, if you could say something about Liverpool generally, and your thoughts about Liverpool and the Northwest, but also perhaps the university, and then finally, if you were giving some advice to an undergraduate about something they should look at, what might that be?
Wow, you've given a broad range of question there, and you've touched something that's a real passion of mine. I talked about being a son of a third son, so I grew up in London. So it was only in adult life that I came up to live at Knowsley and in the, what let's call it nowadays, the Liverpool City region. Yeah. The family Derby, you'd be quite right in sort of assuming that it came from the county of Derbyshire and the city of Derby. But Derby was a royal title that was available to be given out, and in fact, modern-day Merseyside, Liverpool City region is pretty much the West Derby 100 of the Royal County Palatine of Lancashire, so that's where it comes from. Yeah. And over the quarter of a century that I have been living here now, I have become absolutely passionate about the area. For anybody who arrives at the university, it doesn't take them long to find that Scouse sense of humour, that Scouse open-hearted, wanting to tell you everything and wanting to know everything about you. Yeah. And they are wonderful people. Their wit is so quick. They've got there long before you've realised where you're being taken to. But we have got the most extraordinary city. And the idea that we have a city with more Georgian architecture than Bath, more listed buildings than any city other than London, the biggest Anglican cathedral in the world. So the amazing monuments that we have. But then you look at the arts and the cultural side. The Walker is one of the great museums of the world, and I particularly like it because it kind of has a great example of everything, and you get one of everything rather than rooms and rooms of everything. So it's much more pocket-sized and digestible. And the fact that they're the only national collection outside of the capital cities of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The arts, I'm president of the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Society. We can be incredibly proud of our musical output, and for those that don't like the older stuff, let's move ourselves along to the Beatles or Rick Astley or Atomic Kitten. Yeah. We are just wrapped up in culture all the way through. It's a very, very rich history, and I spend a lot of my time trying to help promote the city region. I'm a passionate believer in the Northern Powerhouse. Yeah. Our economy has become much too much weighted back down to London and the South East, and it is fantastic that George Osborne has taken such a lead in trying to redress that and trying to give the northern cities a chance to get ahead. Manchester showed the way, and they've had some fabulous leadership there, and now I think Mayor Joe Anderson is doing a brilliant job with all of the regional borough councils in bringing it together. Yeah. You see this great renaissance in Liverpool. Next week I'm going down to see the new £300 million investment in Liverpool docks to take us into the post-Panamax world so we can handle the largest ships in the world. Yeah. With the Industrial Revolution had its heart in this city region. Without the water, the rainfall coming down the western side of the Pennines, there was no way to mechanise the machinery. Without the docks at Liverpool, there was no way to get the cotton in. And without Ireland, we couldn't bring the people in to help do that work. It's a hugely, hugely important city region, and one about which I'm very passionate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I share your passion for it. Absolutely, it's phenomenal. In the sense of a specific piece of architecture, you've mentioned some of the highlights, but other than, of course, Knowsley Hall or Knowsley Safari Park, which central Liverpool building would you pick out as a highlight that you, other than the Walker, perhaps?
I think go around the corner from the Walker and take a look at St George's Hall. Built really as a village hall for the people of Liverpool, and its majesty, its scale is extraordinary. The first building in the world to have air conditioning in it, and all the Liverpool city motto is all around a play on Rome's motto, and you look at those enormous bronze doors and you realise the sense of scale and wealth and power that the good citizens of Liverpool thought they had at that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a visitor sometimes to the Wirral, but not just the Wirral, other parts of Liverpool as well. And to have a time, well, now I think you've mentioned the Renaissance, and absolutely it's an excellent, vibrant city. But perhaps going back maybe to sort of the 1920s, it must have been amazing. And all just to sort of zooming around with the merchants' houses and just to be part of the vibrancy that I think still obviously exists, but in a slightly different way. But yeah, absolutely. So we have done a short in St George's Hall. In the one of my colleagues, Dr. Picton, he's been in the cells. We let him out though, and then we did one in the main what was the Court of Assize as well. So, but yes, hopefully the students will go down there. And indeed, a plug. There's going to be a bankruptcy history display at St George's Hall in late January, so do have a look at that when it's live as part of the university honouring its civic obligations, engaging with the city itself. But now then, we've introduced Lord Derby and his family, and also his passion in relation to the local area. Now we'll move more to the substance of our discussion. So, as you know, Lord Derby, the course that we're running is a second year LLB course, which is compulsory for law undergraduates. And we thought it would be interesting just to think, perhaps there'll be two broad areas of questions. One is about, and I take your third son London point on board with this sort of planning sense, but we'll talk perhaps about the passage of property and how that's been held over time. And then the second tranche of questions will sit more about your current activity really as a trustee and how you engage and what sort of obligations you have with your charitable activity. So moving to the first tranche then, which is the idea of the trust and the use of the trust. I thought we could perhaps progress through some different species of property, and we're joined in picture form by some of your ancestors that were involved in some of these acquisitions. So in terms of, and again this is a sketch of, because obviously the history is long and full of various property issues. I wondered if you could give us a sketch firstly perhaps about houses and the various houses over time, like Rufford Hall, Avon, and of course Knowsley, and how they've been held and what sort of techniques that you know of have been extant about the ownership of houses, bearing in mind the long history of your family.
The answer is that a lot disappears into the mystery and the sands of time, so I can't comment about a lot of the early ownerships, and it tends to be that some of the properties have been held in trust, and some have been held not in trust, and different trusts at different times have had different remits, uses, and I think that has evolved over time in the way in which trusts operated. I think when we look back to perhaps this sort of medieval or should we say up until the last century or last 200 years, it's quite difficult to say how I really have no knowledge of those details in there. We can read glimpses of some extraordinary legal pitches going on between different family members and complicated inheritances, but I can't give you sort of fact or figure on that. I think if we look at the sort of 18th, 19th century, I think the primary use of trust there was really to stop some pretty profligate people going out and ill-advised young men on the gambling tables, and I have to say I have something of a revulsion to gambling, the thought of the idea of when you hear the absurdity of a house or an estate being lost on the speed of a raindrop coming down the window in some gentleman's club in St James's, or a crazy game of cards. I can't get my head around it. But it happened. We've all read about it, and therefore I see it as an entirely sensible policy to put property in trust and stop silly young people making mistakes, helping them away from the folly of their ways until they were perhaps a little more mature to handle it.
So, on that point, the sort of profligate members of the aristocracy, I think the closest example might be, I think they are a rough-connected ancestor, but the Dukes of Manchester and their problems with perhaps gambling and other forms of activity that heavily dissipated their estate. So perhaps that's one source of why, exactly as you suggest, there should be a protection mechanism. Then perhaps another sort of estate planning point, which again your ancestors touch on this in the sense of being one of the previous earls being a close associate of Lloyd George, and the idea of his push towards heavy taxation in relation to landed property. Do you see that that the trust as a technique to, well, obviously you've just said about profligate people, but also with the sort of inheritance tax planning activity, that the trust can be deployed in that way as well?
I don't think that it's particularly helpful there to that extent. You talked about Lloyd George, that was my great-grandfather, and so clearly things had been passed through to his son, who then died early, so that sort of kind of was a wasted situation. So in 1948, when my uncle died, when my great-grandfather died and my uncle inherited, estate duty at that time was 70% in that time just after the war, and that took inevitably a very, very heavy toll on things. And when my uncle died in 1994, at that point, inheritance tax was at 40%. Now, that made no difference whatever whether it was things he owned in his own name outright or things that were owned in trust. As you know, as the beneficiary or whatever, that trust, it was exactly the same rate of tax. So I would have said it was broadly neutral. I think there are certain things that help with this, which is not the use of trusts, but it is things like conditionally exempt works of art, where quite clearly, if a rate of tax had to be paid on every painting on the wall, so conditional exemption allows certain works of art that are deemed to be sufficiently important to the nation to have a conditional exemption on them, i.e. tax isn't paid at that point, provided public access is given, due scholarship goes on, they can go away to be exhibited or visited in situ, and then it is deferred until such time as an item is sold or one decides not to exhibit it and so on, and certain other reliefs for business property and so on. And that's a very important way of keeping works of art in the country and allowing family businesses to go on. I think the major change that has happened and the real distinction is that where trusts and freely owned capital were taxed in exactly the same way, nowadays trusts having a decennial charge, it kind of amounts to the same thing. If you look at multiplying through a 10-year charge through a typical life expectancy, it's neutral. So you could say that from my viewpoint, does it mean, my heirs and successors have less of a shock at the moment at which I die because that which has been in trust has been paid in chunks each 10 years. So I think it's broadly neutral, and you could say things one way or another. I don't believe that trusts have, or as far as I can see, there are no real cash savings. There's no tax avoidance in it. I think they're more convenient ways of managing pots of money within a family and distributing around, but it is not saving the individual against the taxman.
So instead of viewing them in, perhaps we'll go back to your protection point. So not the kind of Lloyd George point about, as you say, protection against tax, but more the control of an estate, to ensure that it isn't dissipated by an heir or the current holder who might be have a gambling issue, for example. To what extent do you think that? So I have in mind entails, basically the idea of a deed of settlement that ensures that primogeniture, if that's the correct pronunciation, is occurs, but with the landed interests that can go with that to sustain the title and make sure it continues. So to what extent does that kind of deployment of instruments, for example, like the entail or a deed of settlement, weigh on your day-to-day thinking about the future of the earldom?
It does weigh and it doesn't weigh. What do I mean by answering that? In two ways. First of all, Knowsley Hall and the park is held within a trust, and that has it's under the Settled Land Act, something which none of us were born. Indeed, our parents were barely born when that came into law, and it's quite arcane. And I suspect not too many of your undergraduate students are going to be working on the Settled Land Act nowadays. But that entail does mean that it has to follow the person who has the title, or if such title ceases to exist, would follow. It would be that holder. So that does follow it through, but I don't think it's just because... So it is a limiting factor for me because it says this house, this park is going to follow whoever the next Earl of Derby is. But quite frankly, I don't think I would wish to separate it out or away from the title if there wasn't that entail, and that a lot of the estate isn't in trust and isn't in entail. The point you make specifically about primogeniture, and clearly when one looks at equality and egalitarianism and so on nowadays, frankly, aristocracy title is a rather weird anachronism. It's a historical perspective, and these amazing houses, it is not possible to chop them up, even if you thought your children and their in-laws could share a house like this together. And I hasten to add, we don't live in this house. We live in another house in the park, and we'll come back to the use of this house in further on, I suspect. But even if those siblings and their partners could live in harmony, three of them, in the next generation, statistically, that becomes 9. I think we're all quite clear that doesn't happen. So it has to go. So my view on primogeniture is clearly that the title, the land, the bulk of the land, the property goes together. because one's got to try to hold this extraordinary, unique point. And I think we need to be absolutely clear. There are something like 16 million visitors a year to the Historic Houses Association member houses. And they bring an enormous amount of tourism into Great Britain, and it would be tragic if that was dissipated and split off. Yeah. So shares between children cannot be equal, but what I think is important is that other siblings feel they're treated appropriately and fairly, and they need to be given a helping hand to get going so they can feel they can be fair, but see that the effort that goes into, and believe you me, it's not always plain sailing trying to keep these places going. You take on an awful lot of debt as you try to get them going. And I certainly feel an enormously strong sense of noblesse oblige. And as you said in your introduction, I am president or patron of over 100 different charities or organisations in the Northwest. And a very, very large part of my life is spent giving speeches, fundraising, doing things for or on behalf of. Indeed, my wife would say I'm perhaps married to the University of Liverpool as much as I am to her, from the amount of times I spend in different council meetings and various different committees and so on that I chair or sit on through the university.
Yeah. I'm probably going to be in trouble with the Countess again now, then, with taking you away from other duties. Thanks very much for that answer. I thought there's a couple of points that you raised that we might touch on a bit. So you've talked, just for the benefit of the undergraduates and so they can think about the point you made. So we've talked about houses, and then you touched on pictures, and we're surrounded by some very nice ones here. And you were talking about conditions that meant that there were certain amounts of relief that were extant if, for example, the house, Knowsley Hall, is it 1 week a year, I think, for people to come and have a look? That sort of...
The answer is that conditional exemption, and let's face it, I don't think any of us who are stately home owners, inverted commas, see ourselves really as owners. We see ourselves as caretakers for a generation, and I think most of us try to pass things on better than we can. And all houses have different arrangements. Sometimes it's the property that is conditionally exempt. Sometimes it's the contents. For contents to be exempt, they have to be what's called preeminent, i.e. worthy of display in a national museum. And there are different ways in which that is done. We do a couple of weeks of public opening here, and we do quite all charity events, and we do lots of other tours for organised groups. And then there wouldn't be a week that went by without a scholar coming in from some different museum or organisation. So all the way through the year we have the...
On that point, you've had a recent edited collection about where you had Bendall Grosvenor, his activity with that conference that you had.
That's absolutely right. We had a completely fascinating study day here, which was 2 years ago, and it was looking at various aspects of the family history, and we tried to take various different vignettes from different places, and I think it was absolutely remarkable, the spectacular speakers that came and talked about all sorts of aspects. From David Starkey talking about Lady Margaret Beaufort, to David Attenborough said he loved Lear and he would like to talk about the collections of Lear here, and Douglas Hurd said he would like to talk about the Foreign Secretary. So it really was an amazing day with amazing speakers, and we tried to put all the essays together into a collection, and it showed that this was therefore a kind of the house and the family history is a national gem.
Yeah, absolutely, like a hub of very important, long-held contributions to our nation's history. On which point, you've got another conference, haven't you, coming up next month on Shakespeare? Is that
We are next month having a Shakespeare study day here. Shakespeare is fascinating, as I alluded to earlier on, of Shakespeare being one of Lord Strange's players during the period of the so-called missing years when he was up in Lancashire, and nobody's quite clear about what had happens, but his time is really spent between Houghton, Rufford and Knowsley Latham. Yeah. And indeed, Midsummer Night's Dream was premiered at the Sixth Earl's wedding, yeah. So it's an extraordinary linkage. So we have got some of the great experts from around the world coming to talk about Shakespeare, and this year being the 400th anniversary of his death adds a particular poignancy and relevance to that. But going one step further and broadening out the city region, the first theatre in England built outside of London was the Prescott Playhouse in 1580. Right. Now, that only happened, obviously, with the family and the Shakespearean connections, yeah. And that's now coming back to life with Shakespeare North, the project which Liverpool City Region is investing in. Knowsley Metropolitan Borough Council have put a lot of money into, and indeed it's being looked at as something of a Shakespeare triangle with engagement of both Stratford and the Globe, and Liverpool John Moores are getting very engaged.
Oh, okay. Oh, excellent. That's another interesting... I live close to Rufford Hall, so hopefully there'll be some performances there that I can take advantage of. Okay, so I just wanted to touch briefly, whilst we're sort of talking about pictures and heritage mainly, and this might not be something that does weigh on your mind, but I just wondered, I was recently at Chatsworth, and we'll move on to a question that links to that in due course, but the Duke of Devonshire seems to have a sort of acquisitions policy to keep adding basically to the collection to reflect modern art as well as more historical pieces. Do you have a similar process, and if so, do you think about the proprietary ownership of those new objects?
Of course we think about it, and my wife spent 9 years working for the Royal Collection, and so she is an art historian, and so a love, a passion and understanding of art is everything to her. I am afraid that thus far we have devoted the last 22 years since my uncle died to trying to turn the estate into a business, to bring the house back to life. There were large chunks of this house. Really, the key had been turned, and it had been somewhat abandoned. Merseyside Police used about half of the house. There are chunks with no central heating, no plumbing, no electricity. We had a lot of buildings in need of some very bad and urgent repairs. And so energy, investment and debt has gone into restoring the estate to try to take it forwards. And I hope we're reaching more of a steady state, and it will be lovely in the future to be able to invest more in the art. So our contribution to art, I think that is the thing about Stately Home Collections, is they reflect the interests, desires and passions of a member of the family at a point in time. Our collection has really revolved a little bit around portraits of my wife and I. Our son was privileged to serve as Page of Honour to the Queen, so had to be really painted in his uniform. We bred an amazingly successful racehorse that won the Oaks and the Irish Oaks and the Breeders' Cup in America and the Hong Kong Vase. She was called Ouija Board, and she went on to breed a Derby winner called Australia. So we commissioned a bronze of her, a life-size in a cantering position, and we did a half-size of her in a more static position at the stud. So a lot of our commissions have really linked around family, horses, and a sideboard by David Linley that was going to connect the furniture together that we had in the dining room. So we are disappointingly non-Chatsworthian in our collections at the moment. If we had the means, we would love to move in that direction, and I admire them for what they've done. You look at their success with the Freuds, the Elizabeth Frinks, and their sculpture gardens. It's absolutely fantastic, and it's a brilliantly organised and run estate.
I agree on Chatsworth, but then a life-size bronze of Ouija board is pretty substantial. So perhaps we could go and see that at some stage. So has she passed away now then?
No, she's still on the stud. I have a stud, Stanley House stud in Newman.
Oh, okay. Is that where the bronze is? Or is it?
So there is a bronze on the stud there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And this is the last question about ownership and assets. Is the stud and our horses within it controlled in a way that differs to the houses or the paintings in the sense of ownership structures, or?
No, I operate the whole business as a sole trader. Oh, okay. And the stud operates as a part of that, and it's a very conventional sort of balance sheet and P&L.
Yeah. So as a sole trader, you decided not to form a limited company and do it that way. So that's interesting, yeah. So that really marks the end of our questions in the terms of the use of a trust or an instrument like the entail that we've discussed in relation to helping preserve very important items of national heritage. And so therefore we've seen that Lord Derby has been engaging with these structures, and indeed his ancestors have also, to ensure that, well, for example, as he's just said, Knowsley Hall can still stand as it does, indeed progress and be looked after. I just want to move, before we get into Lord Derby's charitable activity, towards Knowsley Safari Park, which, as you'll know by now, there is a equity short just at the Safari Park, which indeed features me speaking, but has lots of animals in the background. So I only appear at the beginning, and then as you'll see, a monkey eating my car appears at the end, which was fun at the time. Like, there's still bite marks in my new Volvo, which is annoying. But anyway, with the brilliant display with the seals, a lot of work that's gone into obviously not just the idea of housing animals at Knowsley Safari Park, but educational activity, because we saw the hawk display, nearly decapitated by one of them, but it was excellent fun. The bats, all this sort of stuff, amazing. To what extent does the idea of charity sit as a charitable structure sit with Knowsley Safari Park? And what's your view anyway of just the whole endeavour that your ancestor commenced in 1971?
My uncle started the Safari Park back in 1971, and his original thing was providing more access out into the countryside, into a beautiful park, doing something that was clearly a commercial venture to try to help support a hall that was pretty unsustainable. And safari parks were very popular. They grew very rapidly, and by the mid-80s we had about 25 safari parks in the country, and one by one they went bust or shut down. And there are now just 5 left. Longleat in the southwest, Woburn in the southeast, West Midlands Safari Park at Bewdley, Knowsley Safari for the north of England, and Blair Drummond in Scotland. It's an enormous investment in the animal. I've rebuilt every single animal house. I have a fantastic team. We've got a really, really good staff. And that, I think, has perhaps been one of the changes around that. We've done a lot of change management and very, very good senior management team. And we really have some fantastic animal experts who are completely passionate about their species. And so what we really work to do, it's about trying, our mission is about giving people access to see animals that they can engage in something that is helping to then educate and inform. And we're talking about a lot of animals that are highly endangered in the wild, and so if what we can do is promote a message about climate change and habitat change, and these are all complicated set of problems that don't really belong in this module. So we try to choose animals that will be interesting and informative for our customers to come and see. We want to entertain, but we want to educate, and we want to help species that are struggling in the wild. How does that link back in? We used to do a lot of what my operations director would call checkbook conservation, where it was kind of writing out checks to different suitable animal organisations, and we've tried to move away from that and find things that we can really link into. For example, the largest species of antelope is called the Lord Derby eland. It exists only in Senegal. It is not the most stable of countries politically or economically. There are only about 300 specimens alive, and so we are working to help fund research into the species, into learning more about it, into trying to create a safe environment, and we try to send more and more of our staff in the quieter winter season to go out. It's something of a boost and a reward to them to go to interesting places and work with different species. But, as I said, we have this fantastically knowledgeable staff, and they can take their knowledge out and help educate people working with these different animals around the world.
Absolutely. I can pay testament to that. We had an excellent talk by a young lady who was, I think she must have been a giraffe keeper. So, you know, up on that raised platform, well, I can't remember the names of the giraffes, but as they came over, she was giving a thorough exposition, which she then did about the elephants as well, which was great. So, on the equity shorts, you can look at those animals that the Lord Derby's just been speaking about in that equity short, and indeed, of course, go to Knowsley Safari Park. So in terms of its structure then, because of the educational activity, is it a charity in nature, or is it a company because of the commercial activity?
No, it is actually running as I said, I operate the whole business as a sole trader. We're very, very open. It's all very, very straightforward. And the only charity I have involved is a small charitable trust, which never has enough money in it, so I'm always having to put more money in to try to help those charities and organisations I'd like to. We are looking and considering a charitable foundation, thinking it might help further our work off-site with some of these species.
That's very interesting. That point is the major thought I had about it, really, particularly in relation to obviously the conservation, the education, you know, all things that have public benefit and are therefore things that, you know, fall under the remit of charitable activity. Well, indeed, like we've discussed before with the paintings and, you know, access for scholars, for example, education to those kinds of items. Okay, this is a nice segue actually, but before we get to this segue into your own charitable work, I just wanted to ask one question which came to mind when you discussed the other safari parks. To what extent do you liaise, for example, with the Marquis of Bath to, you know, how's it going at Longley? What can we learn from each other? Does that sort of stuff go on? Or?
A lot of that stuff goes on at all sorts of different levels. If you like, we have our sort of trades union, if you like, is the Historic Houses Association, where there's a good flow of membership, and I'm very proud that I and a number of members of my senior management team are asked to speak at quite a lot of their conferences, or the Country Landowners Association, because I think we are seen as really having put a lot of best practice into play. There's another group called the Estates Business Group, covering about 25 of the largest, most complex estate businesses, and there are estate businesses, and it is no good thinking of them as sort of aristocrats' playgrounds. Quite frankly, they're going to wither and die in a generation if one doesn't really get pretty active about finding new ways to generate income and cut costs.
I think that was, I suppose, my point about Lloyd George earlier, and well, you know, yes, there's the profligate, for example, the Duke of Manchester, I think it was in 9th and 10th, but you know, and examples of estate destruction through behaviour that, like the window drop idea, which isn't helpful. But then if you've got the, you know, huge amounts of inheritance tax that are so destructive, for example, with Devonshire, and you might have an equivalent here, for example, where first folios of Shakespeare in 1912 apparently was sold to the Huntingdon Library in America. So that scholarship, those documents now go out of the country. One, you know, that's bad, and then two, you know, it was an amalgam of 4 libraries that were incredibly important, you know, not just to the Dukes of Devonshire, obviously, but the nation. So in that sense, is there anything that sticks in your memory that where important parts of the estate or collections like books, for example, have had to have left or not really?
I think it's absolutely true. I cannot believe that there is a major stately home in the country that when it meets a death event, an inheritance tax event, a capital transfer tax, estate duty, whatever era we're talking about, those are major events that are going to involve a very, very large capital payment. It is impossible to suggest that that can't be done without it, and certainly in the case of this family, a lot of land has been sold over generations to fund tax bill, a lot of properties have been sold. Yes, books, paintings, there is no doubt about it. So there have been a lot of losses in that way over the years, but it would be quite wrong if there wasn't. It would be deeply unfair if there was no inheritance tax. And I think we've probably got a reasonable balance. Everybody will argue both ways, but yes, it's an enormous expense and really takes its toll, and yes, books and painting and land go, and yes, debt gets taken on, but it's right that a share should be paid. And similarly, it's right that there are some reliefs and allowances to enable some works of art to stay intact, and indeed to allow family businesses to continue, because actually if you just tax a family to take half away, but the business is dead and all the employees are then lost, and government revenues fall from PAYE from...
Absolutely, yeah. And also this, I suppose the point about the ramifications that flow from that, in the sense of, for example, the Huntingdon, that benefits, but then scholars who would have perhaps been able to go to Chatsworth and look at those first folios now, but that's just my purely selfish scholastic interest. So I'll move away from that, and then we'll move into our final phase of questions, which basically relates to not to your family's use of these instruments, perhaps, or thoughts and planning processes around them, but instead your engagement with the philanthropic activity that you do. So perhaps what we could do now is perhaps talk about the different heads of charity, for example, religion, education, and the idea that the 100 or so charities that you're involved in, what sort of areas they are, and also how you find your obligations as a trustee of those charities.
I think we can split them into two different groups. Let's park the trustee bit, first of all, and say that the start point is the engagement. I have this title, I have this huge privilege, and therefore, as I mentioned earlier, noblesse oblige, I feel really important to put back in. I love doing it. I devote a lot of time and energy to do it, and we love using the house to do it. So that philanthropic thing can be investing time in doing things, in turning up, in helping to open, to give a speech. It can be time in trying to connect people with more wealth that might be able to help it. Sometimes it's connecting people with knowledge sources. Sometimes it's I've got a bit of knowledge and resource about what it is. It's using this house. I can think of a number of different events where we have raised over £1 million on a night. Last year, Alderhay Day was the new opening. It was complex building project, a little behind budget, a little behind time, although it was within budget, I think, and they were going to have a ball in the foyer. The foyer wasn't ready. It had to be brought over and done in a marquee in the park at very short notice, and it raised £1.7 million on the night, and that paid for all sorts of extraordinary extra things, like a interoperative scanner. So it was a scanner, so while a child was having brain surgery, that a scan could be taken and relayed to other experts across the globe. Extraordinary, groundbreaking stuff. For example, Matalan were very generous in their work here with my wife as patron of the NSPCC, and in the Full Stop campaign, and over £1 million was raised on another night here for a building in the city of Liverpool. And so I think using the hall for charitable events in all sorts of different ways. We've got one coming up for Liverpool Cathedral in a couple of weeks' time. I've got one coming up for the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Society in a few weeks' time as well. And so it's used in lots of different ways for lots of different things, which can be raising money, it can be promoting awareness, it can be creating connections, it can be going to and helping. So that is if you like, that's the non-legal responsibility. So that is sitting there as president or patron. And I think a lot of people perhaps at times take on the title of trustee of a charity without really fully understanding or comprehending what that is. And I think one has to be absolutely clear that if you are a trustee, you have a duty at law. Your undergraduates will be made well aware of those responsibilities. So you really have to know and understand the organisation, how it works, what risks it's taking, how it might lose its money, how it might be defrauded against, what it is, what activities is it undertaking? Are they genuine charitable activities? Are they getting caught on a trading charity balance? Trading in the very positive sense of trying to raise money for the charity, but it needs careful handling and managing within different pots and different ways. I am an actual trustee of rather less of those, and perhaps one, if we take the historical context I might mention, is Chetham's Music School in Manchester, where I was asked if I would become a FEFI. I've tried to focus my work in the Liverpool City region, but when they said to me in their letter that every Earl of Derby had been a FEFI since 1650, I felt I had to look up in the dictionary what a FEFI was, and couldn't really spoil that line. And a FEFI, according to the dictionary, is a trustee with principally involving around land use and holding that dropped out of use in English language in the late 1600s. So,
but their instruments still using it as a, hence why they wrote to you.
Still being used.
So would you say then that you're a trustee, and the Countess then is as well, of various charities that you've clearly covered some of the important ideas of how a trustee, a fiduciary might operate, that being a multiple trustee is fed into being a better trustee because you have this broader experience?
I think being a multiple trustee, clearly you have more relevant experience. I try not to be a trustee of too many different things because I don't think it is necessarily the best use of the limited time resource which I have, because as I've said, being a trustee involves a deep level of engagement with the management of that organisation, and it is perhaps better that I don't get involved in so many management committees where I get spread. There isn't enough time if I get too involved, and therefore being able to help to interconnect organisations and people and companies at a rather more general level is perhaps a more efficient use of time.
And also, we can't allow your time to be taken away from the university either by too many trustee obligations. Okay, I think in terms of this phase of the interview, we've reached a nice conclusion. So at this point, unless there are any other points you want to make about the sort of broad areas we've covered about charitable engagement or custodianship of the house and other property?
I think we've covered it pretty fully.
Okay, so I'd like to draw the conversation to a conclusion at this point with Lord Derby. We're about to go and have a look at some portraits of ancestors that have had engagement with the university as well in an important way, for example the founding Chancellor. But from here in the Walnut Drawing Room at Knowsley Hall, I would like to bid you goodbye. So with Lord Derby, goodbye.